Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to today's Design News webinar, Motors and Motion Control for Medical Devices, sponsored by Maxon, NewScale Technologies, and Performance Motion Devices, and broadcast by Informa. I'm Rob Spiegel, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share the webinar via social media outlets, and participate in a Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of the webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you are experiencing any technical problems, please click on the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Okay, now to the presentation, Motors in Motion for Medical Devices. Discussing today's topic will be Kristen Luwatsky, a contributing editor at Design News, Prabhakar Gaurasankaran, VP of Engineering and Strategy at PMD, David Henderson, CEO at NewScale Technologies, and Peter Van Beek, Medical Business Development Manager at Maxon Group USA. To learn about our speakers, visit the bios widget. Okay, Kristen, over to you.
All right. Great. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks to our sponsors and Design News, and thanks to everybody out there in Radio Land. So let's talk about medical device design. Just real quick, I'm going to run through kind of some of the special challenges that this particular niche presents, and then dive into some of the technologies that we can use to solve the different kinds of problems. That's going to encompass motors, drives, and controls, and a couple of key trends that I've been seeing, in addition, miniaturization and integration, but also customization, and also throughout sort of try to draw matches between the applications and the motion components and solutions that would be well suited to them. Let's see if I can get all of that done in 35 minutes. Medical applications run the gamut, and this is only a very short list. I mean, it's everywhere in healthcare is getting to be such a big field. I had hopes of covering lab automation in this piece, but I'm going to restrict it to medical. We've got surgical robots, we've got handheld power tools, implantables, everything from there on out to patient beds, telepresence robots. Motion control may not be the core technology in all of those applications, but it certainly plays a key role, and in some ways that can almost be more challenging if your core skill set isn't motion, it's in reagents or imaging or whatever. You know, that's where the motion industry needs to sort of step up and help these systems come together. So medical market, kind of like the that saying that, you know, Fred did everything Ginger, or Ginger did everything Fred did except in high heels and backwards. Medical market has all of the challenges that the industrial market has in terms of performance, you know, precision. You need accuracy, you need repeatability. The equipment's got to be very durable. Medical providers expect a lot of bang for their buck. Some of the equipment is low duty cycle, but some of it can be really high. You know, if you've got a automatic file for a podiatrist who's, spending hours a day, or one of their assistants. But above all, medical has got to be reliable to a degree that makes military and aerospace put to shame. If you've got somebody on a ventilator, you cannot have that equipment fail because lives hang in the balance. But at the same time, the equipment's got to be efficient, and part of that is, saving power, but there's also a key thing going on here, which is you've got a human-facing element of this, whether you're dealing with systems that are patient-facing or provider-facing. So they don't just have to perform, they've got to be quiet, you've got to have low vibration, and they've got to be efficient so that they don't get hot, and they've still got to perform their core capabilities, and maybe with all of that, they've got to survive a few thousand cycles in an autoclave. So all bill of goods. Before really getting into any of the solutions, I always like to think about it from how do you start from the design, and you've always got to start with the application. Torque, obviously, we've got to consider our load, not just mass, but also inertia. Think about the speed. Think about the envelope. Medical applications in general tend to be space constrained. I don't care if you're in a treatment room or an operating theater or someone's home, or you're trying to design an implantable device. Space is always going to be an issue. Duty cycle, again, that varies. Power source, that's really important. I'll mention more about that later when I talk about drives, but it's not just is it portable or wall plug, but what's the quality of that power, and what are the constraints, and how's that going to affect the performance of your system. Accuracy, repeatability, obviously, but everybody's got a budget. You need to know whether you're dealing with, something that's patient and provider facing directly, and any environmental factors, although those don't tend to be as big a deal in medical as in some scary applications. So let's start, dive right into the motors. Brushed and brushless DC motors. Now, there are not a million, but a whole slew of different implementation of motors, but in general, for a brush motor, you can be thinking of it in terms of permanent magnet stator on the outside, then you're going to have an internal rotor with coils wound around and a toothed iron core. It requires conducting brushes in order to commutate, and brushed DC motors can be really good for a lot of applications. They're simple, they're rugged, they're low cost. They don't have to have onboard electronics, but that said, if you want to use them for precision motion, you're going to need a drive, and you're going to need feedback. That's kind of what puts the servo in servo motor. So there is that, but there's also the dark side, the seedy underbelly of the brushed DC motor, which is, they've got mechanical components. So your brushes are going to wear, that's going to limit your lifetime. Even if it doesn't cause early failure, they're going to need to be replaced. That means maintenance. You can get arcing between the brush and the commutator, and that can generate EMI, which can be a real problem with a lot of the telemetry in the medical sphere. And they also make the motors bigger and heavier. You've got that copper rotor sitting in the center, and there is no clear thermal path to get heat out of there. So one of the issues that you've got is a lot of heat buildup that's going to limit your performance. And in general, your brushed DC motors, you're going to maybe get up to a few thousand RPM. They're going to be at lower speeds. But for the right application, they can do a fabulous job. They are really good for a lot of portable applications because guess what? DC motors, they're happy running off of a battery. And they're really good for simple applications. So, patient beds, stair lifts, power chairs, surgical tables, that sort of stuff works great for brushed DC motors. On the other hand, brushless DC motors are kind of becoming ascendant in the medical industry, although I am a big believer in different courses for different courses. But BLDC kind of flips the brushed DC on its heel, or on its ear. Again, there are no hard and fast designs, but with the BLDC, we'll go with, typically you're going to have your windings on the stator on the outside, and you're going to have your magnets on your rotor. In general, they are considered to be higher cost, but remember when we were talking about brushed DC motor, if you're going to use it as a servo motor, you've got to have a drive. So if you're going to do an apples to apples comparison, when you're pricing motors and so on, you need to price your BLDC motor price against a brushed DC motor with a drive. In general, brushless, you're going to be smaller and lighter because you got rid of those brushes. You're going to get better torque density out of them, and higher speed and better speed control. Now, I tend to get leery about putting numbers out because they change all the time, but if your brushed DC motor can do about, speed control to maybe 10%, brushless can probably get you closer to 5%, and if you really got everything tuned up and you got good feedback and so on, you can potentially even get it to 1 or 2%. They tend to be more efficient. You've got a nice thermal pathway to dissipate heat because your coils are on the outside right next to the housing of the frame. Longer lifetime, less maintenance. You don't have any particulation like you do with graphite brushes on a brushed DC motor, and you don't get that EMI issue. Say that 3 times fast. They tend to be, they're very broadly used these days, but especially high performance issues, they're great. Surgical robots, handheld devices, they're all kind of in the sweet spot for the BLDC. But we also have the question of, we've done brush versus brushless. What about servo versus stepper? Stepper motors have a role to play. I actually talked to a medical designer one time who loved steppers because he said, you know what, I request a step and I get a step, so I'm happy. Not quite that cut and dried. A stepper motor is a very high pole count motor, moves in steps, but because you've got so many poles, it appears to be continuous motion. It has very high torque at 0 speed, but the issue that you get with it is your torque falls off falls off a cliff with increasing speed. And so if you need holding torque, at 0 speed, yay, but if you need higher speed, you're not going to get that with a stepper motor. They tend to use less powerful magnets, which reduces torque generation. Frequently run open loop. The conceit kind of being, you command a step, you get a step. Not quite, again, that cut and dried because you can kind of think of a stepper motor as kind of a mass on a spring type of model. So if you are at 0 speed, then you command a step, the motor's got to break that friction. So you command 5 steps, you might get 4 steps, you might get 6 steps. You don't really know. And that's sort of the downside. That said, you command 25,000 steps, any error that you have on top of that is going to be a fraction of a percent. So for the right application, you know, they can do a really good job. They're really great at pumps. In fact, they're used a lot for medical pumps. You can run them closed loop, and in fact, that's kind of been a trend the last few years of stepper motors running closed loop, which mitigates the issue I was just talking about, but it doesn't really change your underlying physics. So, and you're adding cost and complexity. You're going to get better performance, but you know, you have certain limitations. So if you're looking for lower cost, something where you've got a little bit of a forgiving application, again, a pump is a perfect example, you know, then a stepper might be the way you want to go. On the other hand, you've got servo motors for your very high performance application. And again, by definition, a servo motor runs closed loop. So you're going to get high positioning accuracy and resolution. Although I do need to wave the flag here, folks, as I do on feedback. You know, getting super high resolution feedback is not necessarily going to give you super high resolution motion. Your motion is only going to be as good as the mechanical capabilities of your system. If you got slop in your system, you know, a 24-bit encoder is only going to tell you, hey, I've got slop, and let's try for that spot again, and you're just going to dither. So, you know, within the bounds of the system, though, you can get very high accuracy and resolution. Servo motors are faster than stepper motors. They offer better acceleration. You can also use gearboxes with them. And you recall in the previous slide, we were talking about stepper motors being slow, or not slow, slower. So if you're not getting enough torque, once you get at the, you know, past the slowest speeds, you want to slap, you know, a 10-to-1 gearbox on your stepper motor, have at it. But the downside you're going to run into is you're also going to cut your speed by a factor, you know, by an order of magnitude. So that's, you know, that's the downside. If you need to have more torque and you need that speed, you're going to need to get that out of a servo motor. Servo motors tend to, you know, it's not hard and fast. You can look around and find what you want, but in general, you're going to see more powerful magnets, more rare earth materials. That's going to give you higher torque. And in particular, something that's important with servo motors is your torque's going to remain pretty consistent across the operating range. It falls off a little bit, but you know, you get good torque even out to high speeds. Downside is no holding torque. You can use your controller to command a static position that's going to mimic holding torque, but if you're dealing with a medical application where you've got, you know, a high fill rating, you're going to want to explore things like adding some kind of, you know, brake, redundant braking, explore functional safety with your drives to set up the system for safe braking and so on. So you do need to keep that in mind for this particular application. Another key thing I want to hit is cogging, slotted versus slotless. And this is where I bring up the fact that I mentioned at the beginning, there aren't any hard and fast rules about brush versus brushless as far as where the coils are and where the magnets are. So you can have slotted, brushed and brushless. You can have slotless, brushed and brushless. But let's assume a motor with a permanent magnet stator on the outside, and you got a rotor with energized coils. Now, you're going to wrap those coils around a two-steiner frame that's going to provide the structure to hold the coils if you're dealing with a slotted motor, and it doesn't just give it structural integrity, it boosts the torque because it's iron, so yay. The problem is that the projecting iron teeth are going to be closer to the stator poles, and every time they go past one of the poles, there's going to be a little bit of an attraction increase. What that gives you is kind of a sawtooth shape on top of your motion, and this cogging. Now, certain applications, again, if we're talking about, drilling a plate into somebody's leg, you probably don't care about cogging. But if you're trying to do some much more demanding application where you absolutely need smooth motion, then you've got to go for the slotless motor. Certain companies that make autoclavable motors also use slotless for that. Although there are companies that use alternative materials to have motors that can survive like 2,000 autoclave cycles, I think it is. Something I want to make sure they hit before we stray too far away from the motors is the options that are out there, because it's not enough to design a system that gets the job done. It needs to have some kind of differentiation in the market. So everybody's looking for something that makes them stand out, that's going to grab more market share. And a lot of times that comes down to capabilities that maybe you can only get through customization. And, common wisdom used to be, yeah, good luck with that, unless you're going to be ordering, thousands and thousands of motors from the motor manufacturer or whoever. The lay of the land has really definitely changed there. Most companies have in-house design teams now, and they're starting to think in terms of rethinking what a, quote, good business case is, in terms of, hey, I need you to do a customization of the motor so that I can fit it into my device so that I get the performance I need. And they're not just saying yet and pushing you to the door. Now they want to talk. So customization, exists at a couple of levels. I mean, there's the obvious and easy stuff that can still make a difference. Changes in hole patterns, you want cabling terminations, you want to add a keyway or a bracket or a flange, need to change the shaft seals, you want a different feedback device, whether it's resolution or type, anything like that. That's pretty straightforward. But the interesting thing is these days, changing the magnetic properties to get different performance has gotten much more straightforward, so that you can potentially get them to modify power density or develop a different form factor that's just going to fit in the device that you're building. So there are a lot more options, and in particular, I'm seeing people in the robotics space doing it. Again, your portable devices, that's important. And I put EVs here, but that's really, in my mind, a blanket term. That's everything from your AVGs, your telepresence robots, anything that has envelope constraints. And the way they can do this, for example, if you say, hey, I need higher power density, they can really finesse the composition of the magnet materials. They can make the magnets different sizes, they can skew them or adjust the angle in other ways. They can make it more or less copper-centric, so you're changing the windings. Maybe you have a different number of poles or more turns, heavier gauge wire, and throw caution to the winds, maybe you're changing it entirely. And maybe some of that's happening to change the form factor to get the performance and the fit that you need. And then these days, part of what's making that happen is your motor designers in particular have designed their components to be more easily customizable. They've redeveloped their software so that it's not a retool the factory kind of thing to make some changes, that they're actually able to accommodate that at a not huge cost to the customer and not a massive effort to manufacture. Now, to me, the ultimate kind of customization thing comes through your frameless motors. And that's a way that really, especially for things like robotics, is a super interesting way to differentiate. So, anybody can get a housed motor, but if you get a frameless motor, you're getting your rotor and your stator shipped as separate components so that you can build them directly into the machine. And again, if you're looking at an exoskeleton, if you're looking at some kind of a robotic solution, suddenly you've got much smaller form factors. You can use a gear, but you can also do direct drive so that you don't have any kind of backlash. The other interesting thing is it's hollow bore. So you got a place for your cabling to go. You've got a place for any kind of optical beams to go, water lines, anything like that. So really opens up some interesting possibilities. You see them used in a lot of different applications, but certainly robotic elbow joints, sometimes wrist joints, definitely base, and also, again, telepresence robots. So, when you want to think about using them, is weight a problem? Is size? Do you really have a high torque demand and you're trying to figure out how to get it? And again, do you need the through hole? But the thing to bear in mind is they don't come nicely housed and ready to install. They come packaged separately, and you've got to have the skill sets to be able to align to the tolerances for air gap and concentricity. You need to know what you're doing. Rare earth magnets in motors are really freaking strong, and people can get hurt. So, you have to understand what you're doing. You've got to have the handling fixtures. But talk to your vendors, because, that's what these folks do. So they can work with you and help you specify and pull everything together. Wanted to highlight a couple of trends too that I'm really seeing sort of across industry in general. In fact, I just did something a couple of weeks ago on miniaturization for aerospace and defense. It's really coming into play here. Again, we were talking about space constraints, and in particular, when we're looking at issues like the implantables and, the surgical robots and so on, you can set things up so that you potentially here you've got an actuator and the drive and the stage, all together in one thing, which brings up, actually before we get into the next trend that it brings up, how do we do this? Again, we were talking about what happens in the consumer space. Take a cue from them, and it's not Moore's law, it's really rethinking the architecture. So at a board level, you're looking at how you can combine multiple subsystems on a single board or chip. Can you combine functionalities so that one component takes care of what it needs to do? Ultimately, you walk away fewer components, smaller, lighter, fewer things to fail, less to certify. And I don't have time to really dive into it deeply, but I do want to wave the flag here that if you are a medical device designer, obviously you've got to deal with FDA approval, which means 13584, 13485, excuse me, my brain's gone missing, certification. And that's the responsibility ultimately of the device manufacturer, but if your suppliers are certified and not just ISO certified, then you've got that much more help with traceability, and it can help streamline your part of the process. So definitely important to ask your vendors about. Back to the whole miniaturization thing that we were just talking about, making some of these changes may wind up leading to stacked designs, can be demanding in terms of pick and place. It can be demanding in terms of how thin the conductors are. But for the right application, if things need to be small, they need to be small. But that might also be something where you look to your vendors to do that. Which brings me to the other key trend, integrated subsystems. Trying to put these pieces together, you're going to need for a motion system. You've got to have a motor, you've got to have a drive, you've got to have some kind of feedback, you've got to have a controller, you've got to have cabling. And if motion is your bread and butter, great. But if not, it can get complicated in a hurry. Your system's going to be bulky. You're dealing with multiple vendors, and you're trying to make everything play nice. And they'll tell you it's interoperable, but you're always going to wind up having to write some little script to get everybody to communicate with the software. The industry in general is pushing to simplify things, and especially at a time when we already leaned out with the recession, and then we've got the boomers retiring, and then we have COVID. Engineering skills are limited out there, and a lot of these applications have very specific requirements. So you're starting to see a lot more in the vendor space of these pre-integrated solutions. And one way that it manifests too, and I should back up here. I did these as the large and the small. These are exoskeleton motors. This is a little itty bitty linear actuator with an embedded controller. So large and small, these integrated subsystems are out there, drive wheel subassemblies are out there, but it's also as simple as integrated motor drive. You don't, the bad old days of, you gotta have a motor that goes to, the drive gets wired into the motor and the drive gets wired to the power supply. You can get integrated motor drives out there so you don't have to get the separate components. And the parts are targeted to the application, they're matched performance-wise. You wind up with something that's more compact. You cut out cabling, you get rid of points of failure. Probably more important, the manufacturer is sourcing things that play well together. They are getting things in volume. And again, they're building it to the standards. We're following that 13485. Another integration approach is the whole smart drive phenom, and it's been going on for a while, but it really shines in this medical space because you've got a drive with onboard memory and processing power, and all of a sudden you've got the ability to not have a separate controller in addition to the motor and the drive and, again, your handheld, surgical drill. Instead, you can have a drive doing it all. So things just got smaller. Maybe you don't need your PLC, you don't need your external controller. Everything's coming through a single cable, it's lighter weight, less EMI. It's really an option worth considering. And similarly on the control side of things, it's not just the distributed control, but other options out there. We've still got centralized control. I mean, if you're doing a 6-axis surgical robot, you are dealing with kinematics. You've got very highly coordinated motion. So you're going to need to do centralized control. But some of these simpler systems, not necessarily. But you can also start exploring some really interesting architectures like hybrid, where, yeah, you're doing your centralized control for the highly coordinated motion, and over, EtherCAT or CAN or whatever, you're just, using a smart motor drive to be able to do distributed control for an auxiliary function. And I promised at the end that I would get back to the whole application thing. So we've been talking about some of them throughout, but implantable devices, small DC motors, BLDC motors, 4 millimeters in diameter, those little guys. It'd be built of titanium because you've got to be biocompatible if it's implantable, but you can get high speed out that you need. Going back to the handheld tools, they're going to need high efficiency. You don't want to generate a lot of heat. You don't want vibration because that can be repetitive stress. Again, depending on who's using it and for what, it can have a high duty cycle, and you may need high torque. So what are we going to look at? Yep, BLDC motors. One other thing that I did want to mention, go to the next slide and I'll mention it after. So one other application is your surgical robots. Here it's sort of a mix and match. Again, your base and your shoulder, higher torque, so maybe you're doing BLDC, maybe frameless. Your wrist and your end effector, that's where you're going to need really smooth motion. So that's where we're going to want to look at maybe slotless BLDC to minimize cogging, because we got that haptic feedback we're trying to get from the surgeon to the robot. So that's where you're going to get the optimal performance. And one final comment is portable devices and drives. Something you really want to make sure you're paying attention to is not just that your drive generates enough voltage to run the motor, but that you are going to have enough voltage out of your battery during the discharge cycle to run the drive. So double check, because some drives have lower or higher thresholds, and you don't want to wind up with your device not functioning, for a third of its, charge discharge cycle. So anyway, I believe now we are at the end. So yeah, start out by understanding the options, talk to your vendors, do your research, understand what you need for your application. Take advantage of integration and miniaturization and customization. They're being developed to make life easier. And the other thing is, think in terms of modeling, think in terms of planning. Mechatronics, I am a big fan. You can go a long way with that. And with that, I am going to hand it back to you, Rob. And thanks for everybody's time.
Okay,
thanks, Kristen.
Now we move on to Prab at PMD.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Kristen. Just piggybacking on Kristen's presentation. So I just wanted to, we have 5 minutes, 3 or 4 slides. So just to give you some examples of how small things have gotten. One is the portable part of it, this battery operated stuff, and 2 is the size. So like Kristen mentioned, swap, the weight, power, and heat are all keys. And like she mentioned, how you pick your controller and the motor plays into it. So we're starting to see more and more closed loop steppers in certain applications where they want the cost lower, where it's an end consumer application in the medical space, but they still want the higher performance, they would do a closed loop. So typically, like the controllers we sell are fully integrated, and you start getting to use more of the advanced control techniques like FOC, current control, path planning, and stuff like that too. And all of this, the main idea is you're trying to get it to operate at its sweet spot for the motor, so you're getting less noise and less lost steps and stuff. So just I'll dive into one. We do a whole wide range of boards to amplifiers to drives to ICs. Just to piggyback on motion and miniaturization, this is one of our newer products that we've just launched. Like Kristen was mentioning, this kind of takes advantage of the stackable design. So this particular intelligent drive has 3 cards in it. It has an amplifier, it has a motion control, smarts, and a generic processor that the users can then write code and put into it. So this is actually, it's very interesting. It's about a tenth of the size of a drive that existed 3-4 years back. It's 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, but it can drive up to 1 kilowatt worth of power. Someone had asked about driving a brushless at 80 watts. These come in like 3 different, so based on the current control, they tune to 75, 200, 1,000 watts. And what we're seeing in the medical application, it all depends on the machine design. So they tend to want flexibility in terms of the host interfaces that they connect to. We do Ethernet, serial CAN, and they also want to be able to talk to several different motors. They want to be able to pick a single motor drive that can talk to all motor types. Just with some NVRAM settings and changeable settings, you can then drive multi-motors. So, because typically in a lab automation or medical application, you have what we call smart axes and dumb axes. So you want to tend to tune the motor selection and the drive for that particular end axis. So with this kind of a smart drive, you're able to kind of target all different motor types, so you can standardize on your machine design. And we support all sorts of, you can port higher end protocols that the user runs, like CAN Open or EtherCAT, onto these drives. And it lets you lends itself to a flat architecture where you have all of them connected, or we've come out with a new hierarchical architecture where the host just talks to one drive and it acts like a 4-axis system, and there's an expansion network on the back end, and all the smarts are in the drive. So the host sends all the commands to the first drive, and that does the translation from the host protocol to the local PMD protocol, and you get seamless synchronization across the axes, which is, we're seeing a lot of that where they want very coordinated motion and all the axes acting in synchronicity. And this kind of gets you to that. So I just wanted to highlight one of the newer products that we've launched. I'm actually an engineer by background, so for me, I tend to gravitate to end applications and rendering. So like this one shows a centrifuge, like a blood analysis pump or a medical pump application. Just to show you the scale of the size of these drives, they're pretty tiny. And the carrier card that you put in is a dumb 2-layer card, and all you need is you're customizing the connections. So all the smarts are in the drive. You pick your host interface and your power connections for the motor, and you can put in the connectors, and this lets you to be able to customize it quickly and get to an end market faster. The other application that is very common in lab automation, like pipette control, DNA sequencing, lends itself to being a gantry. So this one shows an example with 3 drives, and just the size of it, the actual base carrier card is very easy to design. So we have some medical customers that have kind of done a single-axis common design that they will then port it to all different end machine applications. That helps them get to They have all the software written and everything ported over, and then they can just plug and play into all the machine designs. So it's pretty small, and this kind of gives you a rendering of what it would look like. So you could do a centralized architecture, or you could do a hierarchical. And the last application I want to kind of show is a surgical robot, a robotic arm application, where it's a distributed network architecture, where you have the intelligent drive right at the axes, and each axis could have different motor types. And what is going between the axes are your network interface, power, and everything else is local to that axis. And the key part from the medical point of view is, with the genetic processor on board, you could do a lot of high-level predictive maintenance, IoT protocols, and all that could be ported onto the axes. And you could export data out that you could then do offline processing and analysis on. And the other thing we've seen in the medical application is where there's a lot of emphasis on serviceability and being able to replace, if this particular axis fails, they don't want to diagnose it remotely. They just want to replace that module. So it'll be the drive with the motor can be replaced. And this sophistication and patents that we have on self-discovery and auto-addressing, where it'll automatically discover that end network node and reconfigure itself. So there's a lot of sophistication in these drives, and it allows you to put a lot of user code, where we've had customers that do sub-micron motion, and they put in advanced compensation tables and path planning, where they would do a certain move, a gross move, and then there would be a fine-tuned move at the end, where they would have a lot of compensation tables based on the mechanical structure of their system. So with a smart drive like this, you're able to do a lot more than a standard drive. With that, I'll hand it off back to Rob.
All right, thank you, Prab. Now we go on to Dave at NewScale.
Hi, thank you, Rob. NewScale is a company, we've been in business since 2002. I founded the company, and we create and manufacture miniature motion systems that make our customers more competitive. And we emphasize 3 words in our products: small, precise, and smart. And when I say small, I mean we make motion devices that can focus the lens in your smartphone, and we do that. And we focus lenses in cameras that are that small for medical applications. Precise means sub-micron closed-loop control, and smart means that inside each module is a complete drive and control electronics circuit along with embedded firmware. So all you have to provide to our modules is DC power, typically 3.3 volts, and digital commands. So these are the things we emphasize in our products, and we bring them to market to companies that want to get to market quickly, where we can simplify integration. And we're in OEM products, robotic automation, Internet of Things applications, and Industry 4.0 applications. We're in medical instruments. I mentioned smartphone cameras, extended reality devices, and neural recording instruments for brain research, along with automation metrology tools. The pictures on the right, the one picture shows, the top picture shows one of our smallest and newest stages. That is, you can see it next to a dime. This is a complete motion module, provides 8 millimeters of linear travel of the top moving plate. And it's being developed for an in vitro diagnostic, basically gene sequencing system. The middle picture shows a mirror, a tilt mirror. So 2 orthogonal axes are rotating that mirror around the center of the mirror surface. And this mirror moves very quickly over the range, and it's very comparable in range and speed and precision to how your eye moves. And in fact, it was designed and is being developed for foveated displays, where it can be used for eye tracking or for dynamic projection of images that follow where you're looking. The last picture on the bottom shows another way that our technology is used, and this is to merge together many, many axes of motion in advanced micromanipulator systems for brain research. So think about 24 axes of motion in a space the size of a football, all being controlled directly from one PC. So that's the kind of things we do. We are ISO certified for medical. We have a lot of patents and IP, and we sell worldwide. I do the slide, right? So next slide is just a few other applications that I haven't mentioned so far. I mentioned this idea that we take benchtop instruments and make them mobile, portable, and wearable. And that really creates new markets and business models that accelerate scientific discovery and brings care closer to the patient, and especially brings care to underserved areas of the world. Miniaturization is what we do and what we're about. When you think about miniaturization, you have to think differently. And I want to talk in the next slide about some of the things that go into that. So most of the presentation today is talked about electromagnetic motors, coils, magnets, iron, and all the things associated with them to create forces. Most of our products work with ultrasonic piezoelectric motors, and these are motors that work on vibrations. We control vibrations that are faster or that are at a frequency that you can't hear or see, but they are used to create continuous motion over many millimeters. And we have several types of motors we use. We've created a patented squiggle motor and a UTAF motor, all based on the idea of motion generated from ultrasonic vibrations. Now, how do these fit in the universe of motors? Well, the simplest way to think about it is if your application requires a motor that's smaller than 6 millimeters in diameter, that's where piezoelectric motors can really start to contribute. They have higher torque density, fewer parts, and higher force density. And there's one takeaway from today I want you to leave is that at NuScale, our piezoelectric motors all operate at battery voltage. We use advanced ceramics that allow us to directly drive the motor from 3.3 to 5 volts. There's no need for an internal voltage boost. This has really enhanced our integration capabilities, and we actually have a single chip drive that you can see in this image next to a dime. The other enabling technologies that allow our miniaturization are very small position sensors, magnetic position sensors using multipole magnets that provide submicron resolution over many millimeters of travel, and we use optical encoders to achieve absolute encoding. We also use the latest microprocessors that have become incredibly small to provide the onboard closed-loop control using embedded firmware. All these things come together for us to create embedded motion modules where they just plug into your device, you provide DC voltage and digital commands, and you get the motion that you need. Thank you. And back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Dave. And then we move on to Peter at Maxon.
Well, thanks, Rob. Peter Van Beek here. I'm going to speak a little bit about, next slide here. Oh, jump 2. Okay. Maxon, for those that don't know in the crowd, is a Swiss-based, privately held global company. And at our core, we're an engineering company that develops world-class electric drive systems. What's nice about our product line is you can kind of see from this first slide is everything is very modular, similar to like a Lego, where you can take a brushed or brushless DC motor, maybe that's the first component you start out with. If you want to add a gearbox, you can, and add a sensor in the rear. And also we make all the drive electronics for all the different types of motors, brushed and brushless, to make a complete mechatronic drive system. Maxon provides standard catalog, semi-custom and fully customized assemblies, even complete drug pumps or like feeding pumps, something like that sort. Since we are an engineering-based company, when you work with Maxon, you'll be interfacing with engineers at all levels of the company. So in my opinion, that helps aid the speed of projects through the system because your engineers talking to engineers. They speak to speak, so to speak. Maxon does not shy away from cutting-edge technologies, and that's very evident if you look at, for example, the Mars rover and the helicopter drone. Those had Maxon products. Extreme downhole oil drilling head or a surgical robot end effector. These are all applications where Maxon finds a home. Maxon is partnered with many leading medical companies. And using an automobile analogy, Maxon is under the hood. But for anyone who's been stranded on the side of a road, your engine is critical. You can see the list of applications that we can be found in where Maxon is under the hood. Looking at some of the pictures on this, if you're performing a robotic surgery, the drives on both the haptic and the robotic side of the surgical robot, they must work flawlessly. And there's no room for it doesn't work. In similar, the heart pump or heart assist pump, which you see over on the far right above the Maxon, when Maxon also plays in that market, the motor must function, and in this class 3 device application, or the patient literally could die. And related to the pictures of where you have an insulin pump, the motor must dose insulin correctly every 3 minutes. And if this drive runs too fast or too slow or fails to function, you can see that's going to cause a serious problem for the diabetic that's wearing it. So again, critical to function, must work. This is where Maxon plays. And the last picture you see there is surgical power tools, which in most cases is kind of a pistol-style grip drive assembly with various attachments for drilling, reaming, cutting when you're doing brain, knee, ankle, hip, or foot surgeries. So again, critical that it's functioning. With all the applications I'm talking about and you see written down there, these applications utilize Maxon because we have consistent quality, extreme power densities, even down to the 4 millimeters, which Christine showed earlier, high efficiencies, low inertia, and quiet. And the last slide, some of the advantages that Maxon offers to med device manufacturers is that we're accredited to ISO 9001 and 1345. We have a strong familiarity with European MDR and FDA regulations, and we help our customers navigate those regulatory bodies when we're working together. In close collaboration with our customers, we develop drive systems tailored specifically to your need. And those can be modifications which are either simple or complex, fully customized mechanisms that may even go so far as being an insulin delivery or a drug pump. We have assemblies which are saline tolerant drives, autoclavable, hollow shafted motors. We have adaptable gearboxes of all types and ratios that combine with the motors, a battery of sensors, and drive electronics for either speed and torque control or full-on positional control. That brings me to the end of my presentation, so I hand it back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Peter. And now, before we begin today's Q&A, please direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the right of the presentation window. If you close the survey, you can reopen it with the widget by clicking the icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you in advance for filling out the feedback form and participating in this survey, which allows us to better serve you. And now on to the questions. first one we have here is actually directed to Peter, and that is, Peter, can you explain Maxon's modular system?
That simply means that you start out basically with a motor. It can be brushed or brushless, DC. We go up to about 600 watts. The size ranges from 4 millimeters up to about 90 millimeters in diameter. You start out with your motor. You can add an encoder to that if you like or not. You can add planetary or spur gearing to that. And even further than that, you can have a linear actuator coming out of your gearbox for basically that kind of subassembly. So that's all modular. You can have just the motor if you want. You can have the sensor, a gearbox, a linear actuator beyond that, and then even to add even that, drive electronics. But Maxon also does contract manufacturing and any kind of, if it was actually a little mechanism, we would make that, could potentially make that whole thing.
All right, thank you, Peter. We have another question here that's directed specifically to David, and that is, should I purchase an integrated motion module or purchase parts and complete assembly and integration in-house?
Well, thanks for the question. So I think the fundamental parameter to consider first is time to market and how much time do you have. And then the second consideration is what's your in-house engineering expertise to complete an integration yourself. And that's going to vary across companies. So those two parameters are going to probably primarily drive the decision about whether you purchase what we call a basket of parts and put them together and integrate them, or whether you buy a complete motion module that drops in and can be integrated in a few minutes. There's definitely reasons to do both, and many companies have different business analysis considerations. Some companies, they're directed to do the absolute minimum bill of material, and that's how they're graded at the end, is on what the bill of material is, even though it might take a year longer to develop the product. But that's okay because that's their business. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, thank you much, David. Then we have another question directed specifically to Prab at PMD, and that is, how important is medical end market related to ISO 13485 certification?
Yeah, it's actually very critical. We work with hundreds of medical OEMs, and they go through a pretty elaborate FDA process to get certification. So the 13485 as a supplier, which we are certified, is very helpful to them because, like Kristen mentioned, you can do tracing of parts, and especially when we start working on custom solutions with them, because we've worked with hundreds of OEMs, and they kind of use us as a technical consultant to help them solve their end machine design problems. Once we get to a custom solution, they want that part number to be locked in, because once they get the FDA, they don't want anything changed. So it plays hand in hand trying to get a design win at medical OEM. You have to have the certification. You have to be flexible enough to do customizations. But once it's designed in, be able to track it and provide that solution for 10, 20 years. So it's a pretty critical piece to it. And all our medical OEMs kind of rely on suppliers that are 13485 qualified to rely on them to do all the traceability and have the processes in place.
All right. Thank you, Bob. And that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you to our presenters. We appreciate your time and expertise in today's topic. And also thank you to our sponsors, PMD, Performance Motion Devices, New Scale Technologies, and Maxon. And within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright 2021 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Informa Markets. The individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, Kristen Lulotsky, David Henderson, Prabhakar Gaurasankaran, and Peter Van Beek, I am Rob Spiegel. Thanks for your time and have a great